Today we're going to be speaking to how to interact with anyone, like your grandma, your son, your daughter, your uncle, like anybody. And we have the pleasure of having Steven on. Some of you might think to yourself, I've seen him before. Well, that's because you have. Good memory to you.
Mhm.
It's a couple of years ago, probably. I wasn't even here last time. So, what is like a good way to get a conversation started? Because I think that's where a lot of people stop. Basically, they want to start the conversation, but
Mhm.
then like, oh, what they're saying, then they just don't do it.
Yeah, I think I was listening to a speaker a few years ago, a psychiatrist, and he was talking about the division within our culture with a lot of the political and social division that's going on. And it's created quite a bit of hostility. And one of the comments that he made, and I agree with it, was that he said the first question that people will ask when they meet you is, "Are you safe?" Now, they may ask a follow-up question like, are you caring? Are you competent? Are you other things? But to get past that first issue, and of course, a lot of people don't articulate that to themselves, but I think that is there in a large portion of society. And I have made it a habit that when I am out and about, whether I'm walking through my neighborhood or whether I'm at work or engaging with family, is I always want that initial impression to be one of politeness, one of kindness. And there is universal language. I think everybody understands a smile. Everybody understands a kind wave. Years ago, I used to walk through my neighborhood, and when I was first there, when I would walk through the neighborhood, people didn't know me. And so when I saw people out in their driveway or mowing their yard or whatever it was they were doing, if there was, I would watch them. And then as soon as we would make eye contact, I would smile and wave at them. And I found that at about 90% of the people would smile and wave back. But what it does is it immediately diffuses any concern that they may have because I present myself as a friend, not an enemy. But if I don't take that initiative, if I don't initiate that action, then I run the risk of allowing their mind to conjure up anything about me. And it could be neutral, it could be negative, but I want to establish that up front. So always a kind smile, a gesture, a kind word to somebody. I think that really opens up the door to conversation at that point.
Yeah, like you mentioned, are you a threat is the first option that our mind go to, which got me naturally thinking about animals. We normally don't think of ourselves as one, even though neurologically we still very much is one. We're like 10% human and still like 90% ape. Like, just think about like how a dog, like I've had dogs since I was a very little kid, always taught about like how to approach him so you don't seem dangerous, because that's how you,
Mhm.
like, if you're dangerous, that's how you get bit.
Right.
Say like the same things with humans. If you come off as some sort of threat, then it can turn out bad for you. But a lot of people seems to forget that. What do you think is stopping people from extending that olive branch, like reaching out and say, "Look at me, I'm not a threat"?
I think a lot of people think either offensively or defensively. And I would say that probably the majority of people that I run into, the 90%, they think defensively and they're waiting for somebody else to take the initiative uh, to dispel any concern or to establish ground. And people think in terms of categories. I mean, we do this from early onset. It's part of the development of the human mind is that our brains automatically think in terms of categories. And as we grow up, it's visual, it's auditory, it's sensational, and the brain collects this data and it categorizes it. And so at a very early age, we see a cat and then we see a cat that's larger, we see a hairy cat, and then we see a big cat in the wild on television. And so there's something about the form there that we begin to identify a pattern because there are certain features that are particular to that species of animal. And we do that not only on a physiological level. Now, as we develop, of course, people give us words, which are really just tags. They just give us a tag for things. But we create these categories and we think in terms of categories. And so naturally, when we meet somebody, we have categories of friend or foe, safe or unsafe, for me or against me. And so people will develop those categories, and sometimes those categories can develop in a person's mind if they spend too much time watching television or listening to the radio, because a lot of that information, especially through talk news, whether it's liberal or conservative, whatever your bent happens to be, it helps to shape your narrative. It helps to shape how you perceive life, and through that filter you interpret the world around you. And that's why I try to start at that very basic level. And I think you're right. Even how you approach an animal can determine how that animal is going to respond to you or react. And I think that becomes something that sets us apart as human beings. And I come from a Christian worldview, so I think we're made in the image of God. And I think that there's something special about us with the ability to think and reason and feel and to have morals and so on. But language itself is very, very interesting. And of course, we communicate many ways. We communicate with our eyes. I've heard a true smile is a smile that always comes from your eyes, because people can smile from the mouth, but it's those little nuances of differences that you can see a true smile. Body language, voice inflection, tone, hand gestures, these all communicate. But we are so unique in our ability to be able to communicate verbally. And of course, to me, that is something that I use in my arsenal to try to befriend somebody. And of course, language, we operate on the assumption that language serves as a reliable vehicle for the expression of ideas. And so right now I'm forming thoughts in my mind and I'm verbalizing it, and it's crossing the airways, being picked up digitally by my mic here and transmitted. But your ears hear what I'm communicating. And because we have a shared bank of vocabulary in our brains, we are able to do this thing called communication. Now, communication can be verbal, it can be written, it can be in different forms, but we operate on those assumptions on a daily basis. Where it becomes challenging and where you have to kind of move yourself a little bit when you're interacting with people is understanding their cognition. What language do they employ? Understanding how to relate to them. Back in April of 2020, I had to step down as vice president of the nonprofit organization where I was working in order to care for my mother, who was at end of life, and she was dealing with dementia. And it was early onset dementia when I stepped down, because I had to be able to prioritize my life, and it meant devoting time with her and caring for her to make sure that her end of life transition was as smooth as I could make it. And mission accomplished. 18 months later, she did pass on February 16th. And so what happened was as I began to interact with my mom and the dementia began to kick in, there were times where she didn't know who I was. And I remember the first time it happened when I was standing in the doorway at her apartment, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you my son or my grandson?" And I just told her, I said, "Pick one. Who do you like the most? I'll be that one." But you have to adapt quickly. And here's the thing, I would tell her to do certain things or not do certain things, and she within 5 minutes would completely forget everything that I said. And she would just go on about her business. And it used to frustrate me, because the normal process of employing language as a vehicle for communication with her did not apply. And so 50 years of interacting with her, I had to redirect my whole thought processes. I had to think in terms of a different paradigm. And I found that very quickly that I had to relate to her on an emotional level, because she didn't have the capacity to understand me rationally. And so again, the normal process, I had to change. She couldn't change because she's got dementia, and it's only going to get worse. It doesn't get better. When a child doesn't understand something, you assume that within a year or two or three or four or five that they're going to get it because they're advancing. But with Alzheimer's, it's the exact opposite. It's only going to get worse. And so I had to shift how I interacted with her. But I had to assess the situation. And again, my default setting was to try to use verbal communication. But again, I found that as a vehicle, it broke down. So I had to relate differently. So I think understanding how people communicate and being able to reach out to them on that level is really what sets some people apart as effective communicators.
When you are in a situation of meeting someone the first time, whether a business meetup or negotiation or in public, wherever you happen to be, what are some things that you use to figure out what their communication style might be?
Oh, that's a good question. Of course, I pick up on certain things. I think we all do. As soon as I walk into, like if I walk into a business meeting, like here in May, I'm scheduled to do a presentation here at a state conference where I'm going to be talking about care coordination and the right of self-determination. And it's going to be in a professional environment. And it's going to be an hour and 15-minute presentation. But before and after, I'm going to be interacting with people who are representatives in the community, whether that's a local DA, whether that's people who work for nonprofits, people who work for state organizations like Adult Protective Services. But when I walk into a room, immediately I'm looking at attire, I'm looking at body posture, I'm looking at how you carry yourself immediately. Physically, what I can see, what I can hear, your tone of voice. Do you communicate confidently? Do you carry yourself well? And so there's certain things that you learn to pick up on, and this is just nuanced. It just comes over time. But then it becomes language. How do you talk to me? What are you saying? How do you view me? And so, but when I come in, I want to be the best version of me. So I want to come in and I want to dress well. I want to dress appropriately, but I listen to them. And so it's a two-way thing. And so what I'll do is generally when I'm interacting with somebody, like if I'm having a business meeting, like I have one next Friday, where we're looking at some strategies to improve our productivity at the office. And so one of the things I'll do is we may have 6 or 7 people in the group, is I will sit back and generally not say anything. I will allow everybody in the group to walk through and to say something, to communicate their ideas. And I try very, very hard not to nod one way or the other. I try very, very hard not to say anything, or no, because what I want is I want them to feel safe. I want them to feel like they're not looking for my reaction. I want my reaction to be as neutral as I can be. And I want them to feel comfortable to talk, whether that's the VP or whether that's somebody who's serving in a lesser capacity, whoever's in the room. And you have people that are on a tiered system, of a hierarchy. And so I want everybody to feel comfortable and I want everybody to feel appreciated. When I go into a room, I also want to have good eye contact. I want to look you directly in the eye, not in a confrontational way. And I learned early on not to sit head on with somebody. I'll sit off to the side. And generally, if I make a comment to somebody, I won't point. I'll use the back of my hand because it gets the gesture across without making somebody feel like you're accusing them of something. I generally try to avoid why questions. I'll try to frame it in terms of how or what. And because language, again, is a very, very important thing. And if I use why questions, people can feel quite defensive. If I ask how or what questions, it frames it a little differently so that they don't feel defensive in how they interact with me. And I want them to respond and not react is what I want. So there's certain things that I have learned to try to develop over the years in just my social interactions with people. And I find that it helps me. And this is whether I'm working at the office, whether I'm working at a conference, or whether I'm working at the federal prison where I'm teaching a class to inmates. I always want to try to develop my skills for each audience that I'm in.
There is.
It's so, yeah, go ahead.
Well, there's a bunch of stuff to learn, like nuances of communication, like you touched upon. Like for listeners out there, how would you recommend them to go about and picking one to start working on? Because it's impossible to do all of them at once. I tried. It didn't go very well. Right. I didn't get very far with any of them.
So I think that listening, I think you can, I mean, I took undergraduate course and a graduate course in presentation. And so I had to subject myself to scrutiny, whether it was a professor or fellow classmates, but I had to be willing to do a recording and then allow them to be able to critique it. And you have to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to be in a vulnerable spot, to be teachable, to be correctable. But what I've learned is to try to find one thing. And so, like, very early on, when I was learning to communicate with others, I used to use a lot. And it became so pronounced and so exaggerated that it became a point of distraction. And so it became a discipline for me to start with one thing and to very consciously and intentionally to try to remove that one thing from my interaction, my verbal communication with people. I had a professor who emphasized body posture, hand gestures, voice inflection, eye contact. And again, it became those things where you would pick one thing and work on it until you feel that you've mastered it, and then move to the next thing, and then move to the next thing, and then move to the next thing. It can seem a little overwhelming, but it's like the question, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time,
Yeah.
right? And so it is one of those things where you do it little by little here and there. So I would say listen to really good speakers, find people, because you can watch TED Talks, you can watch all sorts of presentations, and watch how people talk. And I had a professor years ago, I'll say this real quick. If you want to be a good writer, read from the best writers. Read the best material you can. And I think that's true for speaking. I think if you want to be a good communicator, listen to good communicators and watch what they're doing. Listen to what they're doing. Pay attention to that. And then, to the best of your ability, absorb what you can into yourself and use that. It'll benefit you.
What are some clues that we can look for when we're speaking to a new person and we're trying to figure out, are they really hearing what we're saying? Are they really listening? Are they getting nervous? Are they zoning out? You can't always tell. Some people are pretty good at faking it.
Right.
But how can you really pick up on whether or not there's a good energy and a good engagement in the conversation? And how do you know when to stop? I think for many beginners, that's a good point. It's like, when do I shut up?
I think that there's always a gray area, because there are certain things that are natural, people nodding a certain way. And of course, people can do the artificial nod. They can phase you out and still physically go through that. But I think there's always a gray area where you don't know. And I think you're always going to have to deal with that gray area. I think you have to establish within yourself that you're going to do your best to try to evaluate that person to see if you're really getting through. But I've also learned that when I'm giving a presentation, in my mind, I feel like I'm planting seeds. And I feel like somebody may not fully understand or grasp what it is that I'm saying, but they might 6 months later or 5 years later. And so I don't ever walk away from a situation feeling like it was an absolute loss. Now, that may happen tomorrow. I don't know. But I guess I feel like when I'm interacting with people, it's just learning that language. It's just learning that. But again, I don't think you always know. I had a situation some years ago where I was dealing with a senior client. He was in his late 70s, and he was a Korean War veteran. And we were talking, and his son was in the room, and we were having an interaction. And my uncle served in the Korean War. And I knew what kind of man he was. I knew the generation he grew up in. I understood the language. I understood the values because I'd spent years interacting with him. And so when I was talking with this man, I used words like sacrifice, words like honor, words like commitment. And I try to be aware of the people in the culture that I'm interacting with. And what that does is it allows me to be able to employ language that resonates with them. There's another lady that I work with, and she's much younger than I am. I'm 56. She's probably about 25, 26. But we were talking the other day, and I heard the way she was talking to me. And then she picked up the phone and started talking to somebody else in a completely different set of language. And when she was done, I said, "Oh, nice code switching." And she kind of cocked her head and I guess was surprised that I understood the terminology. But isn't that what we do? that we do this code switching, that we switch. The way that I speak to people when I'm talking at the federal prison is different than how I'm going to interact with people at the office. And so I think our ability to do that and to understand the language of that, I think you just have to be mindful. It's a constant process of learning. So I don't know if I answered the question or spun off on that. So.
I like the lingo of code switching. It is
Code switching.
It is just code that makes sense because it's common to all of us.
Sure.
So since you brought up code switching with females,
okay.
What, Mike? This sounds crazy.
Most business meetups you go to is a bunch of people that haven't met each other yet. That's the point of the meetup.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any specific things that you would recommend when we're talking to a female stranger? Like, obviously, we don't want to be careful not to stand too close, obviously. But are there any other secret codes that we should know?
Well, I think within yourself, I think you have to establish a set of protocols that you are going to abide by initially, whether that has to do with, again, body posture, tone, choice of words, how you interact, because until you really interact, you really don't know that person. You don't know if they're aggressive. You don't know if they're timid. You don't know if they're offensive, defensive in their thinking. You just don't know. And so I think one of the things that I do is I try to put myself out there first. And I do a lot of training at my nonprofit. So we have young degreed people. We have interns that come in who are working on their bachelor's and master's degrees. And when I take them with me, because I always have to spend a day with them out in the field. So we go out in the community. But one of the first things I tell them when I schedule my day is I say, look, I just want to be up front with you and let you know that I'm a certified serial yacker. And so just so you know, once I start talking, I will not stop talking until you interact and you tell me and you want to interject something, or if there's a pause and you want to ask a question. But I just let them know up front, hey, this is something about me. And once I start, I'm just going to keep going. So just so you know. And what I find is that when I tell them something about myself like that, even in a somewhat playful way, it diffuses any tension that might be there, because 99% of the time I get a smile. And then I just launch into being myself, because what it does is it affords them the opportunity to say, WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. And they feel like that's authentic. They feel like that's genuine. They feel like what they see is really who you are and not some mask that you're putting on and trying to fake. So I would say, just establish your protocols and be yourself.
Always good advice to be yourself.
And people know that, don't they? I mean, even children at a very young age know when you're being genuine. So,
yeah, it reminds me of my son when he was 4, and his mother looked at him and said, "What's wrong with you?" He said, "There's nothing wrong with me. It's the rest of the world."
Yeah.
Well, children are definitely the most honest. They haven't filled up that field of what's okay, what's not okay.
Right. They lack that filter, but that's something that comes in time. What I found, like with my mother, when her dementia really kicked in, was she lost that filter that she had when she was younger. And she would say the most outlandish things that you would just think, what? But yes.
Well, yeah. And some people never develop that filter. They just say whatever comes to their head, and you just stand there, have to adore whatever just was said.
Sure. And I think people have different IQ levels, and I think you can classify IQ in different ways. I do think that there is I think there's a scientific IQ that a person can have, maybe good with mathematics, engineering, science, that sort of thing. I think that there's a literary IQ where people have a very good command of language. I think some people have interpersonal high IQ, that they know how to interact with people. Salesmen, politicians just naturally seem to have that charisma. But apart from interpersonal, there's also the intrapersonal, the things that you know about yourself, that ability to introspect and to engage in that self-talk, and to know what's going on. And I think there's different kinds of IQ and skill sets that people have. I was talking with my wife the other day because we were talking about navigational IQ. And I was a forest firefighter for 2 years, and I was one of those people that just naturally could navigate a landscape terrain. And even when I was a chauffeur for a little more than a year, if I was driving around the city, I could very quickly orient north, south, east, and west. But other people I know, they do not have navigational IQ. They have the hardest time navigating anywhere. But I think IQ is different. And so I think those interpersonal skill sets, I think some people just naturally have intuitively, and I think other people have to learn and apply themselves quite intentionally. I think it's a discipline of mind, a discipline of will, and a discipline of habit that over time develops those qualities that you want to have as a good interpersonal communicator. So
I can attend to some people can't find their way. My mom is, well, yeah, she will get lost everywhere and anywhere.
You live on an island.
Yeah, there's a limited amount of lost you can get.
yeah.
If you just walk around the coastline, eventually you'll end up somewhere close to the house at some point.
Mm-hmm. But I think that demonstrates the point, though, that I think people have different forms of IQ. I am not good at science and math. You know, my sister has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering. She graduated summa cum laude. I graduated, thank the Lordy. And so we're very different, her and I. She has the scientific mind. I'm more bent in literature, in history, and philosophy. I mean, I spent 4 years studying classical and Koine Greek, and then 4 years studying Hebrew and philosophy and theology. And, you know, these are things that are of interest to me, and they seem to come to me quite easily, whereas other people struggle with those things. So I think, it just depends on your proclivity, you know, and how you're bent in a certain direction. Some people are artistically inclined, have very high IQ in the sense of art. And again, just different skill sets, you know, different IQ skill sets that people have. So
it's so true. I'm glad you only said now that you're very interested in Greek culture and stuff like that. Otherwise, this podcast could have taken a very different turn very quickly, like it sometimes have done.
Moss believes that the Danes are responsible for Western civilization, and every good thing in the Western Hemisphere came from Denmark.
I probably have said that sometime. Let's take that back a little bit. Nearly everything. Yeah. Only for like the past 1,000 years or so. We take credit for that. Well, if we're just gonna start the second Viking crusade or whatever, they probably didn't call it a crusade. Pillage. The second Viking pillage or something similar to that.
Pillage is a good word. Yeah,
it's probably closer to what they did.
I want to end on a really relevant question to most of our audience. Most of our audience are at the point where they're employing hippennials and millennials and, you know, whatever generations. How would you help people put down their phones and engage in actual conversations?
Okay, yeah, and that is a discipline as well. I think success in any form of life, and I don't care if it's financial success, academic success, social success, business success, I don't care. It's about discipline. It really is. It's about discipline of mind and discipline of will to establish habits. And I think that there has to be intentionality there. I know when I'm having a conversation with somebody, if they come into my office or if I go into their office, either my phone is on silent mode and it's put on my hip in my case, or it's put face down on the desk or in a drawer completely removed altogether. I cannot wait for somebody else to take the initiative. I have to be the one who makes that initiative. And I have to try to demonstrate and model the best behavior that I can. But I think engaging with people and really learning those skill sets requires us to be able to discipline ourselves to put down those phones, to put down those devices, because let's be honest, they can be quite addictive and they can very much be a distraction. I know if I'm in the office and you're sitting there and I'm typing on my computer over here and I'm looking at you occasionally, I'm not really paying attention to you. but I made it a habit that I will put my screen on black mode. I'll put my phone in my drawer, and I will turn around and I will look at you directly. You have my full attention. And that has to be intentional with your eyes, with your body, with everything about you. You have to engage that person. And then when the conversation's done, then you can go back to doing what you were doing. But I think you really have to, again, it's about discipline. It's about good manners is really what a lot of it's about. And there's a social etiquette, there's an office etiquette. And I think learning what these things are and implementing them, putting them into practice will serve you so well. It'll serve you so well.
Well, it's a great point to end. And folks, if you want to reach out to Stephen, his links are down below in the description. Take this to heart. Learn how to communicate. Up your game. Moss and I have seen far too many startup businesses fail because the founders don't have the ability to communicate with human beings.
That's right.
Learn something from Dr. Cook.
Yeah, one thing I think everybody also should take away from everything that Steven said is take the control. Right?
Take the initiative.
Go out and actually don't wait on somebody else to do something. Because then you're like, you don't have any control. Like try to have as much control of a given situation as possible.